Hi, this is Kaitlin Butler with the Science and Environmental Health Network, and today I have the pleasure of sitting down with Gasior Altman to talk about her recent publication, American Petro-topia, which came out earlier this month in Aeon Magazine. A little bit about Becki before we get started. Her work explores environmental legacy, what we pass from one generation to the next. After earning her PhD in sociology from Brown University, Becki served as a lecturer in the community health program at Tufts University until 2012, and in 2010 she joined the board of the Science and Environmental Health Network. Her research and teaching has focused on the global fate and transport of pollutants and Arctic contaminants, children's environmental health, chemical policy reform, biomonitoring, and the rise in green ecological medicine. Her writing weaves the personal with the scientific and visionary, often taking the reader down a path of personal narratives to explore the complex history of synthetic chemicals, the legacy of pollutants, and their burden on our bodies and our environments. She's working on her first book, In the Path of Wayward Pollutants, which explores the history of synthetic chemicals, body burden, and the legacy of persistent pollutants in U.S. communities from Alaska to Appalachia. Amidst this project and continued creative writing and independent scholarship, she is also the mother of 2 boys. Hi, Becki. Thank you so much for sitting down with me today and talking about your recent piece. The genesis of the piece was about 2 years ago this month. Can you describe what the process of writing this article has been like?
Oh, sure. And thank you for convening this conversation, Kaitlin. I'm excited for the chance to speak with those who are involved in the Science and Environmental Health Network. Well, about 2 years ago, I was actually on the phone with Executive Director Carolyn Raffensperger and the President of the Board, Madeline Scammell, and we were having a conversation about projects that we someday hope to do but never seemed to get around to. And I had told them that my father had made plastics and that I had spent most of my life being deeply curious about that experience for him because it happened before I was born. And I had told them I was baffled by my level of curiosity about this experience, both in terms of just wanting to understand my own father better, but wanting to understand that era of the 1960s and the rise of plastics and how society entered into this relationship with this material. And so anyway, I have always had this in the back of my mind. I had wanted to go to this plant for well more than a decade. I had started thinking about going to visit it and wanting to explore it probably since early 2000s, even before I even applied to graduate school. At this point, Carolyn and Madeline, after hearing me talk about this, said, "That's enough. Just go make this happen." And in fact, commanded me to get off the phone and call my father right then and there, which I did. And that launched me on a journey that I had no idea what it would become. I just decided to take this trip with my dad and take him with me, take this plant and whatever else he thought was meaningful and wanted to show me. It just so happens this corresponded with the release of Dan Fagan's book, Tom's River, which is another New Jersey community located about an hour south of where my dad's plant had been located, and which had been the site of where some of the waste from his plant had been illegally dumped. And so it became part of this larger story about another community that was struggling with a large number of kids who had a variety of different cancers. And so this book had just come out, and we were able to read it in parallel right before our trip, and it informed the trip in ways that we could have never imagined because it closed some of the loops, and it helped explain some of the questions that he had as a young man watching these third-party unmarked waste haulers, in these unmarked trucks, kind of rumble out of the plant carrying away the waste, and he never knew where it went. He'd always wondered about that, and so some of those barrels turned up in Tom's River and were part of the story that Dan Fagan helped to tell. And so our trip took on even more significance. because of that book. And in fact, it inspired us to visit Toms River after the plant to see one of the Superfund sites where the Union Carbide waste had been buried, and to then go to pay our respects to a cancer memorial that had been erected for some of the kids who had died. And then the trip just snowballed from there in terms of its meaning, its significance, the number of synchronous events that ended up happening for me, for him afterwards, and in our continued exploration and journey into the legacy of plastics, both for us personally and for the society. It really, the genesis was just this one call where two colleagues and dear friends said, you need to go do this now. Time is of the essence. And so I'm very grateful to them for that. It took me another year after that to get to the point where I could begin to write about it. And then it took me another half a year to write it. So anyway, this was all born on a late March evening, this idea of taking this trip together. But it reflects, a decade of hoping to have that kind of experience with him.
Yeah, it sounds like it's been a pilgrimage long in the making. Did writing this essay change you in any way now that it's this thing that you've been looking forward to is finally coming out in writing? Any epiphanies, new directions now that it's out in the world?
Yeah, I think I'm an academic by training, but deeply passionate about writing, and I've stepped away from academia for this past year to really focus on developing the craft of writing. And I think that this piece, it was really a way to cut my teeth. I learned a lot about myself and how to write. And I think I solidified an approach or a voice with which to approach material that I had been writing about for a long time, but more, from the professional identity as a sociologist, with a much more removed tone. And I've been writing about legacies in that way for a while, but I've always been curious, could it not be more compelling if I could write it with a more narrative approach? And because I have this interesting family history relative to the things that I study and care about, how could I use my family history as a port of entry into the material so that it's not really about my family? My family just becomes kind of how I can compel readers to keep exploring issues that mean a lot to me. And it seems kind of worth trying, because I think numbers and chemical names are the kinds of things that can make the mind gloss over when we're reading about it, and allow for this distancing to happen, and for readers to feel like I'm here as the reader, and these issues are out there beyond me, somewhere else, happening to some other. And so I'm exploring a method or an approach to try to make talking about legacy and plastics and long-term pollutants more accessible. And so I think I tried out an approach with this piece, and I would like to continue applying that approach to other writing about other forms of environmental legacy. And so I would say that would be the biggest change in my writing. Personally, it's been an incredible experience to bond with my dad, as an adult. Now I'm the age where he was when he left plastics, to have that connection with him and a chance to have gone on that trip with him. He's turning 75 next month, so that was personally it was like an experience of my lifetime, and for him to in his 70s to be able to have that chance for the look back, which he took very seriously and very soulfully and very spiritually. I think that was a healing journey for him, for me, and for my wider family, which has struggled over the years for other reasons, but this has been a meaningful way for us to reconnect.
before that journey, you went on a different journey. You attended and were one of the central organizers of the first Women's Congress for Future Generations, which was first held in Moab 2012 in Utah. And you actually also drafted a pretty large portion of the resulting Declaration of the Rights held by future generations. Your fingerprint is all over the writing and the work and the ideas that came out of that event. Did your experience in Moab impact this piece in any way, given that it came so close before your trip with your father?
I think the entire experience of the Women's Congress was was a series of very defining moments for me. I would say as much of that was about the place in which that event was held in Moab, which is in the Red Rock country of Utah, sandwiched between two majestic national parks. I had never been anywhere like that before in my life. I grew up on the East Coast, where you don't really get the eye can't really take in the scale of this landscape because it's little pockets and hills and the roads are windy and you can't really get a sense of scale. But out there, it was an immense landscape. I hadn't really been a part of an immense landscape like that. So it stretched my concept of space, but even more so, it stretched my concept of time. I'd never been immersed in geological forms that made so apparent the passage of time and deep time, geologic time, things measured in millennia. And so that was startling to me, to be in this arid, dry landscape that the map tells me used to be an ocean, and to be walking along and see on the red rocks themselves petroglyphs and petrographs from ancient, thousands of years old, from ancient inhabitants of that landscape, and to think my feet are on top of how many different generations of human footprints. It was unfathomable to me. So that was a mind-stretching experience, and to feel part of the continuum and the sweep of humanity. At the same time, intellectually being asked to think about our relationship to generations far forward in the future, and so the whole, it was just a stunning opening for me. I'll say too, though, it was also a very salient time to be thinking about who we are to the generations to come. Right on the banks of the Colorado River, just north of town, near where we had assembled on the last night, there was this huge pile of uranium tailings. And so it was also quite salient, the level of destruction in which is currently happening within this generation. And so the contrast between justice within this generation and justice for future generations was also was palpable in the landscape around us. So I think when our minds open up to a wider time frame and a wider horizon, I think we're capable of thinking about problems, in a different frame. And I think it allows, and it's kind of taught me to speak at a different level, and to try to reach for the bigger, the more grander conceptualizations of the problems that I had been writing about in a much smaller, more diminished way. So that was a very important experience. For me personally, I felt like my role was as a listener and as a scribe, someone who was there to try to capture everything that was going on around me, all of the threads and the themes and the points of agreement and the points of disagreement, and to try to capture as much of that as I could and to channel it onto the page. And so I think things came through me, but not necessarily from me.
Kind of along those same lines, and you had brought this up in your response, and I just wanted to explore it a little bit more, because it's this idea that scientists can work from essentially the head and the heart, and that then has kind of built in over the years this understanding that ethics is a necessary companion of science, and that we can work from that understanding to kind of redefine the way we approach certain questions. So my question to you is, as an environmental sociologist, not tons of people know exactly what that means. With that title, how do you look at these issues of environment and justice?
I'll try. Let me work with an example. Some of the other issues that have commanded my attention and commitment to better understand have to do with the global distribution and environmental persistence of a certain class or category of synthetic materials. These are the persistent organic pollutants. They're things like PCBs, DDT, the idea that these chemicals that have these long tails in terms of how long they can last in the environment, and that they kind of broadcast their consequences forward in time. And when I was in graduate school, I spent most of my time studying the capacity to measure those kinds of pollutants, not just in air samples or more sediment samples or water samples, rivers and lakes, but actually in the human body. It's something known as biological monitoring, or biomonitoring for short. And so I looked at the rise of that technology and where it's located, and it's somewhat contested interpretation, because it's not necessarily clear-cut all the time what it means when a chemical is found in the body if there's not also corresponding health and safety data, which for most chemicals in commerce there isn't. And so it isn't necessarily a straightforward number to interpret. And that's some of the work that my fellow board member Bhavna Shamasunder has been working on. She looks at all at kind of different perspectives on these numbers about how much of a chemical is in the body. It can when I did some work similar to Bhavna's and looked at how community groups, for example, up in Alaska, were dealing with issues of Cold War military installations that had been abandoned and left behind a huge stockpile of PCB contaminants. And they were also receiving contaminants through the food chain and the long-range global distillation of these contaminants from factories and other uses in lower latitudes. They ended up, a small community asked to participate in some research, to have their PCB levels monitored in their blood. And then the community and the organization ended up getting into these long debated technical arguments about whether or not what these numbers mean, and what solutions and responsibilities they suggest. And even though we have very good data on PCBs, it was still, in terms of their health significance, it was still a very contested and difficult series of debates and conversations that ensued. And so we get to this question of, at what point can we no longer rely on science to tell us what we should be doing? That science has given us this data. At this point, it's unethical to say that it needs further study before we can act, because it's that trend is already kind of well documented. We understand the northern migration of contaminants. We understand that these contaminants are building up in the marine and terrestrial food chains and disproportionately affecting subsistence communities that live in the circumpolar north. So this question of, at what point do we move from science into the realm of morals and ethics to make decisions? And I think body burden and biomonitoring is a really strong example of that crossing over into, at what point we have to stop asking questions or demanding of science to answer them, because there is a point in which the question becomes trans-scientific, beyond the capacity of a scientist to answer, and into the moral grounds, and into only public discourse can answer the question of, is this bad, and what do we need to be doing about this? So that's how I think about the limits of science.
Absolutely, and I think it certainly applies to these issues that require such a multidisciplinary approach to understand them, and to be able to walk the line between these data that we're receiving and then the value and the moral choices that come with that information.
I've thought a lot about what my role is as an outsider. I in my work, I thought about production systems of chemicals, and I identified kind of places along the way that where I would call it a chemical's life cycle. It has its birthplace in the factories. It has its midlife on the market shelf and in our homes as it's incorporated into products, and then it has its end of life and immortal afterlife in the case of persistent pollutants. In far-flung places, but we also know that for some chemicals, that tends to be a concentration at the kind of the northern latitudes. And so when I had begun this project, I wanted to march myself along this production system from a chemical's birthplace to its, resting place, and look at the kinds of places that were affected along the way. And to look at the kind of social relations wherever the chemicals touch down. Tons of scientists had begun kind of mapping the migrations of chemicals, and I had seen these maps. And as a social scientist, I thought, what is it like to live along those byways, those migratory routes, where these chemicals were touching down and concentrating in certain places? And so I set out with those set of questions. But every place I went, I was an outsider. I was not from that place either, and I, in some instances, I was kind of also an outsider because I am kind of moving into a kind of community that is different from the kinds of places where I have lived. And I mean that in terms of kind of class privilege and just the kinds of life experiences that there was, the gulf between myself, who grew up in a suburb and has, mostly resided on, in the privilege of kind of college campuses. And so I thought a lot about being an outsider, and particularly in Alaska, when I was traveling there, I really began to think of a social scientist as yet another part of the extractive enterprise, that I was heading to a place that had been so thoroughly extracted from and been dealing with the consequences of outsiders coming there, taking its resources, and then leaving the consequences in place. And I was thinking a lot about what does it mean to be an ethnographer, to go into a place, extract its stories, and leave. And so I was quite sensitized to that, and still think a lot about that how not only how did I comport myself when I was in these communities, but also now that I'm back home and writing them, what is the right stance with which to speak from and to amplify these stories without claiming to be the final arbiter of history as to what had happened, and to refer back to the original sources where these communities are speaking on their own behalf. I see myself more as an aggregator of their stories and trying to put them in conversation and in juxtaposition, because I think that something can be learned by putting the stories of places arrayed along these production systems together, so that we can see the whole system and all of the people and places that are affected by a common set of pollutants. And so I don't know. I don't think this is traditional social science as it's done, but it's more of just the active juxtaposition of putting stories next to each other and in conversation, and hoping in so doing to amplify their message. It's much more of a humbler undertaking than I have no grand proclamations to make myself.
What about as a mother in the work that you do? So much of your work is with children's environmental health. What about that identity in the way that you look at these issues and write about them?
I mean, there's the practical constraints of having to write in the spaces in between mothering. I don't know. I've often thought about that. I think I became a mother the same year I finished my PhD, and so I feel like I launched a career and a family in this very same span of time, and that was bewildering to do. And for a long time, my identities were very separate, and I haven't quite figured out how to embody both of them at the same time. I will say that one of the last communities that I was visiting while doing my research for what was then my dissertation, what is now the book that I'm working on, I was pregnant with my first son. And I had gone all the way to Alaska, and I had thought for 3 years about the significance of persistent pollutants on particular communities, on who we are as a people, on our moral imagination, but there was a certain critical distance between the material and the places I went and the people I had the chance to speak with that I didn't know was there until I became pregnant and felt both a deeper sense of connection to the world around me and the women I was particularly speaking with, and also I felt more permeable than I'd ever felt before. And so it took on a very different and much more personal meaning to me. Once towards the end of the project, I became pregnant with my first son. I felt like I became part of the story, and that one of the biggest challenges in rewriting and kind of reapproaching the material now, years later, has been to really think about what it means to know that we are living in an era in which we are manufacturing materials that have such a long tail in their consequences. And I've been really thinking more about what it means to be part of that system, particularly one in which my exposures are nothing compared to, for example, a mother living on a fence line with some of these industries. And we are connected by this system that we are both embedded in. And what are my responsibilities at this moment in history? And I say this at a time in which there's been 10 years of kind of books and kind of popular discussion about pollutants in bodies, in which they yield top 10 things you can do to address exposures. And I think it's time that's important to reduce exposures, especially when thinking about future generations and for the health of children. But I feel like the adjunct and the add-on to that is that I want a wider conversation about who's bearing the greater burdens. And even as a mother, in which I really started thinking about my own obligations to my children, it really brought me to think about my wider obligations in society, about kind of calling out these issues and amplifying the voices of those who are exposed at such higher levels than someone like me, not working in these industries and not sharing a fence line with them. I guess to sum that up, I becoming a mother while doing this work has increased my sense of obligation for others, and not just my own children.
I've noticed in some of your writing, plants come in to save the day as teachers and as entertainers for your kids. There's some great pieces about, pole beans saving the days and raspberries. And I was going to end the interview with perhaps one of the most important questions on the docket, which is, do you have any plans for your garden this spring? Are the boys going to be planting anything?
I'm actually a terrible gardener. I want to be a good gardener, but I'm not. I'm terrible at it. No, we have no plans. We hope the raspberries make a comeback. It's funny. I never set out to write about plants, but it keeps happening, and so there's obviously something there to explore. I'm fascinated by the idea that factories and flora have come to share the same term, and I have written about the difference between planting and burial, and the role of gardens and helping tantruming kids, and the role of planting to helping me move through the grief of a miscarriage. And in all of those pieces, plants were not the I never set off to write about them explicitly. So something is going on in my subconscious that keeps me writing about them. Every year I have hopes that I'll get something to grow, but really it's the things that grow on their own that really do the best. And I wish it were something different. I wish I can more reliably produce. I've been able to get some tomatoes growing and
right.
and some beans, but I think I supply the neighborhood animals with stuff.
It reminds me of the seed banks that we're starting to create to kind of maintain the diversity of seeds in the world, and perhaps the seeds that you're planting are just the writing that you're giving the rest of us to archive this 4 generations of chemical history that we're now sort of beginning to face. I think that your writing is one of the best ways for people to begin walking that path. And thank you so much for creating a space and a language to let others see that world in a way that's accessible. It would be remiss without it. Well, thank you so much, Becki. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk about some of your work. Your essay is still available online, correct, with Aeon Magazine.
Yep.
Can people just search for American Petro-topia and they'll be able to access the essay, correct?
I believe so, yep.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again, and I hope you have a great rest of your week. And any final thoughts for the listeners before we sign off?
Well, I'll leave you with one final thought, and it might be an interesting exercise. That's one that I've done with my students at Tufts. I always find it interesting to line up history and biography. And so I always encourage, when you're reading anything about chemicals and plastics, is to try to map where your own family history lines up with that. And you can think, this year that PCBs came out, it was the Great Depression. Where were the people in my family? Where were they living at the time? And how do their stories intersect? And I actually think many of us can retell our family stories through the lens of these materials, and find something really illuminating about it. And I think the more that we can connect our stories with the stories of the materials around us, the more that we can move to a more comfortable relationship with them, and a comfortable relationship with making moral decisions about what materials are good for society to make, and what materials impose too much of a burden on current generations and on future generations. And I will leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Becki.
Yeah.
Talk to you soon.